So this is a common question. I've gotten almost, I think, anywhere in the world I've gone and I've spoken to young people. It's the question about masturbation, the permissibility of masturbation. People say that they're single and this is a way that they're looking to protect themselves from engaging in illicit relations. So what are your thoughts, Sameera, on that?
This is such a common question I receive too. I hear the same thing, that Muslims are trying not to engage in zina, so they're seeing masturbation as the lesser sin. And I'm also seeing this come up in other contexts. For example, divorcees who are now wondering what happens. I was able to be sexually intimate with my spouse, and now that I'm single again, does this rule apply to me? I think we're finding also that linked with pornography use, masturbation and pornography use often go hand in hand. And there's even some women who are saying, well, do the rulings apply to women? Because it seems like a lot of them are male-centered and we tend to associate masturbation with men. So these are questions that I've received that I'm sure you can shed more light on.
So the issue with masturbation is the majority of the jurists argue that masturbation is impermissible, and they point to certain verses in the Quran. It's a pretty standard argument, and it's a well-argued legal argument. There are some dissenters, one should be fair in saying, and I think that that's why it continues to be a question from the Sharia point of view. And the dissenters are saying that there is evidence that it is the lesser of two evils. That's basically the other argument. So there is something to be said about that. The problem, when I say something like that, the problem with that is that in our experience, dealing with people who have these different types of problems, masturbation is something that it usually requires a certain type of stimulation for the act to happen. So the person that engages in the act also will seek that which will stimulate the act. You just mentioned pornography. That's obviously a common activity that people will engage in to stimulate that. If somebody is on the cusp of performing fornication or something like that, if it's to that degree, of course the lesser of two evils, that will be the case with any Sharia ruling. Taking the lesser of two evils is an usuli principle. But the problem with that is that everyone is going to have to then determine for themselves what that limit is for them. Of course, being patient is better because of the majority legal opinion. But to be honest with you, it's not really the legal issue that I think is the problem. I think the problem is that once somebody starts down that path, it's oftentimes difficult to stop. And it's a problem for both men and women, as you've mentioned. And the hypersexualization of the world around us is, I think, feeding into those type of desires.
So, Paula, it sounds like there is such protection within Islam in terms of the snowball effect you mentioned. I mean, it's in a way protecting us, and there's great blessing and hikmah in that and wisdom that we may not realize. And in terms of single Muslims, it's very clear in terms of what Islam says. Now, the question becomes, some Muslims confuse this in marriage and marital intimacy, where they say, well, no, masturbation or foreplay with your spouse, that is also not permissible. But I think we need to distinguish between being single and outside of marriage, and then using acts of intimacy with your spouse within marriage. And I think that the Sharia is quite distinct in that, I believe.
Of course, I mean, when it comes to post-marriage, there's really only one act that we know is impermissible, which is anal sex. But any type of sexual act, function, activity, as long as it's with the consent of both the husband and the wife, the Sharia is permissible. God says in the Quran, وَأْتُوا حَرْثَكُمْ أَنَّ شِئْتُمْ, addressing men, approach your wives, as is traditional interpretation of the verse, the way that you want. In other words, positions and things like that there's no right or wrong. And oftentimes those acts of intimacy, foreplay, whether they involve sometimes toys or not, will actually revive the intimacy between couples. And that's also an important thing to keep into mind. I think when it comes to masturbation, what we're really talking about is issues before marriage, when people are single, or as you mentioned, divorced and in transition. Again, making marriage easy, making it something that's accessible. In addition, the prophetic advice of fasting. Why would the Prophet say to fast if you can't get married? Because fasting, not that fasting takes away the sexual desire, because you break your fast at the end of the day, but
Mhm.
that the act of fasting allows you to practice self-control. That, for this duration of time, I'm going to say no to things that are permissible. I'm not going to drink coffee or water, etc. I'm not going to eat, and I can survive. So by doing that day in and day out, for people that are single or in transition, if they're divorced, etc., it allows them to practice that type of self-control. That's the self-control that you need when it comes to controlling your sexual desire as well.
That's so important. I think self-control, self-awareness, and then being able to say no to oneself is really important with this topic.
I agree.